Okay, so I'm going to show the screen up here. So welcome everybody. Today is August 26th. So we have a couple people in the audience, so yay! I can't flip it around so you can't see everybody else who's here. So, but, at least you get to see me. Woo, yay, that's what you guys all really want. Okay. So just a couple of announcements for you all about the class. If you guys looked at the Blackboard site, I updated it on like the little side panels over here. So I thought these were more logical names for things than what they give us as assessment. I'm sorry, I call it assignments. It makes more sense to me. So if you click on the one that says syllabus, it's the syllabus. This is information about me. There's the announcements where you guys got about, sorry for the confusion, but I think this is going to work out really well. So like Madison, if you're going to come in or, we're going to start working on things in the lab. I'm here on Mondays and Wednesdays. So I might as well record this live if I'm going to be here in the lab anyways on Mondays and Wednesdays. So if you guys ever need me, I'm here. I can work on different projects. I'll be up in the lab. Okay. So I'm always going to be here on Mondays and Wednesdays. So this will be live. For you guys who want to come. And then on Fridays, it's the Zoom. And so there's the Zoom login. There isn't one this Friday. So just keep that in mind. We don't start this Friday. It starts the Friday afterwards. Okay? Lectures are here. And what I'm going to be doing, as you can see, I'm going to just put the different dates. And so as time goes along, you'll see the different dates. And this will be where, you click on this, it'll have your lectures on here. And I'll put down if it's on a YouTube or it's on Coursera so you guys know where the lectures are. And then each lecture material will be on here. You can see here's the lecture. So I gave you guys the actual PowerPoint slides. So you guys have those. So you guys don't have to, you didn't get something. It's all on there for you. And there's also the readings. And then I'll put down here the lectures. So you guys will have everything that's associated with today's lecture in one spot. So this is the first chapter. And I guess, Cheyenne, did you get a copy of the book?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, awesome. I don't know if you've gotten a copy, Madison, or not.
Yeah.
Okay, good. And so if you guys have any problems with getting the book, let us know and we can work out something. Okay. And then assignments, you guys have your first assignment. I wanted to go over with you real quick. So what happened was actually this happened 2 days ago, and I still have to fill this out. I do have my own little consulting company, so I do expert witness. So when we start talking about like civil action and we talk about different things, we'll talk about what it's like to actually do with expert witness. I don't want to have a consulting firm where I actually do the investigation. Because I don't want to. Some of my friends who are hydrogeology ones, they actually do the investigations too, and so they hire their students to set up little firms inside of their companies, and then they hire their students to do research projects for them. Well, consulting work. I'm not to that point. So, but I do expert witness. So I got this letter about this case that's over there. And so what I'd like for you guys to do is answer number 2. So number 2 here is, what are some of the factors you would consider in order to determine how the chemicals got into the surrounding soil and water? Okay. So what I want you to do is come up why you would pick those things. So what's your list? Even though we really haven't had the class, you guys have all had geology classes. You guys all have undergrad degrees. So what would you put down as the most important? Then I'll go through my list too. And on Friday, we'll go over all of that together and we'll kind of see what everybody is talking about when it comes to this kind of stuff. What would you look for? Or what information would you need in order to do it? And so we're going to use it as just kind of a thought exercise. And you can read all the rest of the stuff. They also ask me these other questions, but you don't have to worry about those. I just wanted to see what you guys would consider some of the factors from environmental. Okay? And so the assignment is under the one that says assignments, and then this is your assignment right here. And then supplemental materials was my other thing I had on here. So when we start getting into, this one's called In the News and Documentaries. So if I have anything that's in the news, like cool news stories that's about contaminant hydro or anything I find interesting, I'm just going to throw them in here, okay? And you guys will get a notice that there's something cool inside of there. And then readings, if there's any particular readings I want you to do, and right now all I have is the whole book for Silent Spring. You can also pick that up if you'd like. You don't have to use this version of it, okay? So that is the updates on everything that's on here. Is there any questions about what's going on when it comes to Blackboard and everything?
So it's due this Friday, but we're going to discuss it next Friday?
Yeah, what day did I say? I didn't want you guys to spend too much time on it.
Wait, we don't have class this Friday.
Right, we don't have class this Friday, but I wanted to. It's due on the 28th by the end of the day.
Okay.
So this Friday. But we don't have class this Friday. Right. Yep. Okay, so that's everything associated with the online. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is go into the lecture for today and full screen. Let's see if this works. Oh, is it going to be this funky thing? Okay, I'm going to move this down here. Okay. Move this. Oh, no. Okay, I was over there, it's fine. Okay, so what we're going to do today is, you guys should see the slides. Okay, good. We're going to talk about sources of groundwater pollution. We're going to talk about where do they come from, what does it mean to be a contaminant. You know, this is your beginning lecture, the introduction to the topic lecture. So what is a contaminant? Well, a contaminant is all solutes introduced into the hydrologic environment as a result of man's activity. Are referred to as contaminant, regardless of whether it's significant degradation of water quality. So it's anything that gets inside of the water could be considered a contaminant. In this one here, this is from Freeze and Cherry, which is the Introduction to Groundwater book. This was the first textbook that was ever written on hydrogeology, was written in 1979. And so this was their definition of a contaminant. It had to be man-induced. Well, since then, we've really kind of amended that to also include not just, what we, man putting contaminant into there, or humans doing it anthropogenic, but we're now also including natural occurring solutes. So we're not just including us dumping chemicals like BTEX into the ground. So do you know what BTEX is? Do you remember, Madison, what BTEX was? Ethylbenzene, okay. And then xylene. So did you know that? So one of the things you'll get out of this class, everybody, is you're going to get these lists of these acronyms that are used in the field. So one of the big ones that we use is BTEX. So it's, I'll see if this works here. If I put something on the board, or am I tethered? I don't think this will work really well. But it's BTEX. I don't know if you can see that through the screen or not. But this stands for benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylenes. So I don't know if you guys can see it on there. I don't know if you guys can see it, but it's BTEX, stands for benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene. And those are the main contaminants from gasoline. So when gasoline gets spilled, which is a normal anthropogenic contaminant, when it gets spilled, the first thing that's dissolved in gasoline and that gets into the groundwater is benzene, then toluene, then ethylbenzene, then xylenes. Okay, and they're also the most carcinogenic is benzene. So it's not just us putting gasoline, because oil is also found naturally, and so you can find groundwater that's near where there's oil reserves. It will have these compounds in it. So it doesn't have to be man did it. But we also are including things where we mobilize something. So saltwater intrusion can be considered a contaminant. Even though saltwater comes in, is denser than fresh water, that denser water, well, we pump near coastlines, we will draw in that saltwater intrusion. AS, what does AS stand for? It's not as. You guys know from your periodic table of elements what AS is? Arsenic. Yeah, so arsenic. You can speak up, Cheyenne. I can't hear you with these things on. So, okay. Particulates can also be, so this could be microbes. So if you have diseases like from sewage, so this could be E. coli, it could be, it could be a virus. So, one of the big questions, actually I was discussing with the biology department the other day yesterday, was, they're going to be doing a project here in the second semester looking at the dorms, the effluent or the sewage that comes out of the dorms, and look for COVID in it to see if we can use the sewage coming out of the dorms to get an idea of how much viral load there is inside of the building. And can you use sewage as a way? And there's a group out of Northwestern, the university, that's already doing that. And so we're going to be linking up with them and the U of I to do a project where we're looking at sewage. Can we estimate how many people in a community have it or not based on sewage? And so does that get into the groundwater? It could be particulates like asbestos. Asbestos could get into groundwater. And one of the big ones that I'm really big into right now is the idea of micro or nanoplastics. So as plastics get degraded and they get broken down, so like this plastic shield here, as it breaks down, it'll put little bits of plastic. As you drink, every time you open a bottle, you shred a little bit of that plastic that's inside of that plastic bottle, that lid, and a little bit of those plastics get inside of your drinking bottle. So you're actually drinking microplastics all the time. There was one paper that came out about tea, that was out of a little tea bag, and they showed as you heated up the bag of tea, how many little bits of plastic were inside of your tea then. So we drink in and take in a lot of microplastics. Now, can those microplastics get into groundwater? We don't know. So this is part of the project that we're going to be doing some research projects on looking at that. We have found it in karst. So what is karst again? Cheyenne, you remember what karst is?
Like caves.
Caves, yeah, caves and stuff. So, groundwater moving through caves and systems and stuff like that. We found microplastics can move in those because, we've got big things. But can it get through a sandy aquifer? And we're going to talk about colloidal transport here in a little bit, and that's where microplastics would fall in. We also have immiscible fluids. This is solvents and things like gasoline. So this is my BTEX compounds I mentioned. Solvents like TCE. So TCE is trichloroethylene. You guys will know that one by the end of the semester so well that you will know everything there is to know about TCE, but we're afraid to ask. Solvents like that, and like that homework assignment I showed you guys, that was dealing with solvents being dumped into the environment. And up until the Clean Water Act, you could dump any chemical you wanted into your backyard. So that was kind of a norm. In practice, most people link groundwater. So I always use GW, not for George Washington or for George, whatever. It stands for groundwater. Contamination to aesthetic quality and health risks. So a lot of times, even though the water is perfectly healthy, but people don't like iron in their water. For some reason, that rust that gets into it, they think it tastes bad and stuff. So they also link aesthetic qualities to it, and then also health risks. We try to set the health risks for you to get cancer from drinking water or anything in the United States at 1 in 10,000 people to get cancer. And so when we start to see clusters where the cancer rates are higher than that, and we know of a specific groundwater contamination, then we can say that there's potentially groundwater was the source of the contamination. So as a result, the definition of whether a given aquifer is contaminated or not constantly changes. It constantly depends on what you want it to be. One of the things that we'll talk more about later on is this idea is if no one is ever going to use that groundwater, do we need to clean it up? If it's never going to come in contact with humans or animals, it's not affecting anything, but it's polluted, and we make sure it doesn't leave where the pollution is and it's just kind of sitting there, do we need to do active remediation of a site, even if it has no impact? No one's going to drink the water. It's not going to impact any sort of stream or river, so it's not going to impact an ecology. Do we have to do anything about it? And so one of the things that a lot of contaminant people will say is, well, we'll just make sure it doesn't leave the site. Why should we actively clean up everything? If no one's going to go there, no one's going to use it, why should we clean it? But we need to mark that it is contaminated. But what do you guys think? Do you guys think we should be cleaning up everywhere? Or do you guys think if no one's ever going to come in contact with it, we can leave it alone? So if we made a mess, we should clean it up? Yeah, okay. Yeah. So the dollar amount, so when we start to think about that, that's the ideal idea, on it. But when we start to talk about dollars and we start to talk about money that goes into it, it's so expensive to do it. It's much easier for us to do what's called monitored, We just monitor the site. We'll go out there and make sure it's not moving, because a lot of times nature will take care of itself. So we do what's called monitored natural attenuation. We let nature take care of itself. We let the microorganisms take care of it, and we just make sure that it doesn't leave that site. So that, from a financial point of view, that's what we do, okay? Because otherwise it would cost billions and billions and billions of dollars for something that has no impact. And so who pays for it? Is it the chemical company who did the thing? And a lot of times, like you said, if we made the mess, we should clean it up. Or sometimes we can't even find who made the mess, or the people who made the mess went bankrupt, or they're no longer around, so who do we get? And that is why we set up Superfund. I mean, I'll talk about it later, but Superfund, one of the reasons we set that up was we put a tax on all companies that make chemicals. We put it into a big fund of money so that sites that are orphaned, that don't have anybody who can clean them up, we have a source of funds to clean those up. So we do clean up sites where there is a potential impact to humans or to nature or to a stream or a river or anything like that. There was one site, you've been out to Calumet before, Madison? No? Oh, we should go out there. We'll do it next semester sometime, or some point. We'll go out to Calumet. It's got a pH of 13. The baseball diamond that's right next to one of our sites where the pH of the groundwater is about 13. EPA is going in there because the kids have been playing on the soil and they're finding that all the soil is contaminated and everything around the site is contaminated. So should they let kids be playing baseball where there is no lead in the soil? And so those need to be cleaned up because now it has a human impact. Okay, impact of groundwater contamination. So must have a source of contamination. So there has to be something that was dumped into the ground. And then there's transport pathways to the area. So how is it going to get to you? So if I spill here and you're over there, but the groundwater is flowing that direction and you're now put a well over there and you're up gradient from the pollution, the pollutant can't go up gradient. It's going to move with the groundwater, so you'll never be impacted. So you could be right next to a pollutant source, and as long as you're not and as long as you're down gradient from it, you're going to get impacted. But if you're up gradient, it isn't there. So you have to look at the aquifer, the wells. Is there wetlands nearby? What's going in there? And there's an increased risk of health of the environmental damage as a result of the contaminant. So one of the other things that we always look at is the environmental damage. So it's not just to humans. A lot of times people only focus on human contamination and like what does it do to human, but we should also be thinking about the ecology, the fish. We'll talk about pharmaceuticals at one point later on, and we'll talk about like human antidepressants getting into the water. And the problem with antidepressants getting into like streams and rivers, what's happening is like little minnows, they're so chill because now they're taking antidepressants that they don't run away from predators. So yeah, they've actually shown this. They're like, yeah. So drugs that impact us can impact because they're so small and just a little bit of it can impact the poor little minnows. So is that a truly environmental contamination issue? Is the poor little minnows and stuff. So health risks are very difficult to assess, and the definition of acceptable risk is very subjective. And we can see that what's going on today. All of us in this room in the university here are very much like, oh no, even if one of my friends gets sick, this is unacceptable. We want to keep health risk really low. This is why we all wear masks. But other people are like, well, the chances of me getting it is so small in their mind that they're willing to take that risk. And so risk perception of what is a risk and how much are you allowing to be a risk changes from person to person. So some people will take more of a risk, and you can even think of this as sporting events. I will never go surfing if there are sharks in the water. To me, that is an unacceptable risk I am not willing to take. But for somebody else, that's an acceptable risk. And so risk is really hard to define, and we do have some ones that we do set, but we do have issues with some of those numbers. Groundwater contamination by bacteria and viruses are fairly common, especially in shallow areas. If we find E. coli, or if you are from different countries of the world, they say E. coli. So E. coli or E. coli is a bacteria that's found in our feces. It's a large percentage of our feces is just bacteria. And so and it has to live in our nice warm back bodies, and it has to have all that organic material for it to survive. So if we find E. coli in the environment, we know, especially in a well, we know that if we find E. coli in that water, we know that there's a recent source of fecal pollution. So feces are getting into it. So it could be from a sewer leaking, it could be from a septic system, it could be from something. Same thing with viruses. Viruses have been known in groundwater for a long time, and a lot of illnesses come from this. This is where I started off. My whole research was going into this field, was working in looking at viruses in the environment. And so, again, discussions this week when they were talking about things are like, oh, what do we use for controls? I'm like, we've been looking at viruses in sewage and groundwater for 30, 40 years. So I think the methodologies are pretty well known. We don't need to reinvent the wheel just because we're looking for COVID. They're everywhere. Usually when viruses get into there, these are things like norovirus, which, causes massive amounts of nausea and diarrhea. So when you get sick, a lot of times you go over to rural countries or you get sick. Sometimes it might not be the food you ate. It could be a virus or a bacteria that's in your drinking water. Groundwater contamination by trace levels of solutes, usually in groundwater because it dilutes so much that it's usually pretty dilute in trace levels of it. So sometimes these things, there could be, if it's really high levels, it could cause immediate health effects. They're really rare. There's generally for groundwater, it's especially if you're drinking groundwater, it's this long-term exposure. I'm constantly drinking a little bit of it. We'll talk more about like pharmaceuticals. What does it mean if you have like a little bit of antibiotics inside of your drinking water? What does it mean if you have a little bit of antidepressants in your drinking water? It's not a pharmaceutical level of it, so it doesn't cause a level to change inside of your body, but it could cause effects from the water. So groundwater can get contaminated in a lot of different ways. So we have our leaking underground storage tanks. So leaking underground storage tanks, we call them LUST, so L-U-S-T, so LUST sites. So, or U-S-T, so underground storage tanks. And this is really common at every gas station. So every gas station has underground storage tanks. And so if they have, up until the 1980s, you only had to have single-walled gas tanks of metal put into the ground, and there wasn't any methodologies to monitor how much leakage there was. So the federal government set regulations that said you have to monitor if you're having loss, and you have to put in double-walled ones. So this put a lot of mom-and-pop gas stations out of business because they couldn't afford the upgrades. But those leaking underground storage tanks leak. I mean, this is a really common source of probably one of the largest pollutions of the ground is these gas tanks. The gas station that was over on Annie Glidden and 38, the one that's really close to that intersection, last summer they had their tanks pulled because they were leaking. And so they had to shut the gas station down, rip up all the tanks, put in brand new tanks. Other things, refineries can leak. There could be solvent leaks. These things can also happen when there's been some leakage associated with like hurricanes, natural disasters, earthquakes. If you are prone to earthquakes in an area, then they put in earthquake systems into here, like, make sure that it can handle it. But you can get that happening. You can have septic systems. You can have farm fields like we have around here. We have road salt. We'll talk about road salt as a potential contaminant out there. We can talk about herbicides and pesticides. We can talk about different DNAPLs, leaking, other things. These organic compounds, nitrates, microbes, all these different things can get into our drinking water supply. We can have our aquitard here that it has a hole in it, so everything can go right through it. We can have an abandoned well. This is why you have to refill in abandoned wells, because you may do something at the top and then it gets into your groundwater. So groundwater contamination comes from a lot of different sources. So in there. So there could be point source pollution, such as landfills. That's a big source of pollutants. if the landfill is relatively new and well constructed nowadays, the landfill liners that they put in, the monitoring networks they put in, and the what they're called bioreactors. So what they do is all the leachate, the water that comes through the system, is then pumped back to the top so that it constantly is circulating in there. Or the leachate will come through the landfill and then they'll take it to a wastewater treatment plant for treatment. But if it's an older landfill, a lot of times they leak because they were not put in properly. They weren't put in with the geomembranes in there. And that happens because a lot of times old landfills were just put wherever there was a hole in the ground, and so they just kind of started filling it with trash. So like the landfill here in town, the old section of it leaks. The new section doesn't. So the old section, they put in monitoring wells. They've got a whole series of wells around it to contain that contamination in there because it was an old limestone quarry. So that's why that was put there. Non-point source are things like pesticides, fertilizers from farmland. We'll talk about nitrates a lot because nitrates are a common contaminant. The problem is it's widely distributed, and who do we find out who did it? So we have different categories for different types of pollutants because, there's certain ones that you're kind of like, oh, okay, lower risk, higher risk. So category 1 or sources designated to discharge substances. So category 1 is like septic tanks. Septic tanks, the whole point of a septic tank is to dispose of waste into the ground. It's to treat your sewage from your home and dispense water into it. Cesspools or leachate pools too do this, and so there's about 16.8 million in the United States of these septic systems and cesspools. So it's a large source. So whatever you put into your septic system, if it doesn't get degraded within your system, will get into groundwater in there. There are also injection wells. So we can talk about injection wells for things like fracking, but more importantly, we do have injection wells at like certain industrial sites where they inject the waste into groundwater. So it's one of the common ways. Down in Mexico, what we use is they put the sewage effluent into the salt water because they figure no one's going to drink the salt water, right? So we can inject waste into salt water. This is the same thing with the CO2 sequestration. What we're doing is we're taking CO2 from the atmosphere and we're putting it into the ground. We generally put it into salty brines because we're like, well, we're never going to drink it. It's so deep down, it's never going to impact anybody. Let's put the pollutants down there. So out of sight, out of mind. So that's what happens with injection wells. And then we also do land application of certain types of substances. So I was out in the field on Saturday and it smelled very piggy outside. Well, one of the reasons it smelled very pig-like was there were so many pigs and they sprayed the manure into the ground around the area. So it was very, very piggy. It was very fresh smelling. So just so you know, Cheyenne, DeKalb County is the #1 hog producing county in the state of Illinois, and there's 4 pigs to every person in this county. So at some point you may smell pig. It's just the way we live out here. Okay. Category 2 locations are sources designated to store, treat, and dispose of substances. So landfill leachate. So leachate, again, that's the water that comes through a landfill. What does NIMBY stand for? Not in my backyard. So NIMBY is a big problem with a lot of these things. So when we talk about social justice issues, a lot of times community groups will be like, well, we don't want this in our backyard. And it goes usually into areas in which the people cannot fight or into areas where, so a lot of times when we talk about social justice, a lot of poor neighborhoods, low income areas, Native American lands are usually where a lot of these things get disposed of because they don't have the rights to stand up. And so usually richer neighborhoods can fight against having a pollutant in their backyard. So we'll talk more about that when we talk about pollution. Open pits and residential disposals used to be a lot more common. I mean, when I was growing up as a kid, my mom worked on the weekends, so one of my dad's favorite activities to do with us kids was go to the dump and go look through trash. The more I think about my childhood, the more I realize why I'm really into pollution nowadays. I mean, I spent my Saturdays and Sundays at dumps, So I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah. So there are those surface impoundments. So a lot of wastewater treatment plants will have surface impoundments where we keep things, or like a mining operations will have surface impoundments. They'll have areas where all of the leachate from it will be kept on the surface, but that can leak in there. So mined waste, graveyards. We'll talk a little bit about that when we get to talk about arsenic. But graveyards, old graveyards used to be a major source of it because they used to use for embalming fluids was arsenic. And so because they would remove all the fluids of your body and then replace you with stuff that you wouldn't decay. And so they would put in toxins into your body. And so then when those bodies start to decay, those become sources of it. So it's graveyards could be a source of it. Nowadays, you don't get that because your body is put inside of a casket, which is put inside of a vault, so in there. And then storage tanks. But we'll talk about old graveyards. That one's kind of a fun one. Category 3 are sources designed to retain substances during transportation. So this is your pipelines and sewer lines. Pipelines and sewer lines can be fun. Leak. We can usually estimate one of the largest recharges to an aquifer is leaking drinking water lines and sewer lines in people's homes. So that can cause problems. Category 4, sources discharging substances as part of their planned activities. So this could be irrigation runoff, salt application. So when we start getting into wintertime, salt gets applicated, everything. Urban runoff. So every time you dump something onto the road, all of the city sewers all go right to the rivers and streams, which then can discharge into groundwater. Percolation of atmospheric pollutants. So things that get into the atmosphere can percolate down into the ground. So anything that goes up into the atmosphere could be fine. And then mine drainage. It fits into category 4. Category 5 are sources providing a conduit for contaminants water to enter aquifers. So this is like production wells, so drilling a well or improper construction. So this is where if a water well is put in incorrectly, you dump something into the well, it could get into the aquifer, or if you do not have the annulus, so between the pipe and the ground, usually you cement in or grout in that well. Well, if that grout doesn't work and you dump something next to it, it could use the edge of the pipe and just go straight down into the ground. Or if the pipes themselves have a leak inside of them or a crack, then that crack can allow the contaminants to get into different points. So you have to have those properly constructed. Category 6 is naturally occurring substances whose discharge is created or exacerbated by human activities. So saltwater intrusion is a great example of this. If you live near a coastal community, we could draw in more of that saltwater because we're taking that freshwater lens out for drinking. And as we're drawing more and more water, we will cause that contaminant to move into there. Another example of this is natural leaching of solute minerals. So this is arsenic. And we'll talk more about this one, but when we change the anaerobic or aerobic conditions of the soil by pumping, we can actually mobilize arsenic. So arsenic is found naturally in a lot of soils and stuff, but a lot of times human activity is what causes the contaminant to actually mobilize and get into drinking water supply. And this is really kind of out of focus. One of the reasons I like showing this is like I mentioned before about risk. Like certain people figure, oh, this is not that big of a risky thing, so they're willing to take a risk. Some other people are very risk averse. And so this just tells you how the relative risk of something into there. And then this gives you an idea of how risky it is for you to be doing these things. So drinking chlorinated tap water really isn't very risky, but there is a little bit of a risk associated with it from chloroform or from the chlorine that's in there. Here's one I do a lot, beer, because of the ethyl alcohol, increases my risk. There's more of a risk of problems, health issues, and stuff like that inside of there. So you have more risk by drinking beer, by drinking wine. My coffee is not as risky as, having a cola. Some of these things will cause you to get, here, breathing air in a mobile home for 14 hours because of the formaldehydes and indoor air pollution has been shown to be bad, will increase your risk versus going to a swimming pool. Breathing air at work because of the formaldehyde is high, or taking a sleeping pill, especially if you're taking barbiturates, it increases your risk versus taking like a pain pill. So everything we do in life causes risk. Life causes death, so you're going to die. So what are you willing to take as your risk is a big consideration in all of this. So contamination in groundwater is generally more difficult to deal with than contaminants in lakes and streams. Okay, so when a pollutant like the oil spills happen from a leaking tanker or something like that, or if it's in a river or stream, those are really generally pretty easy to contain because we know where the water is from. We can divert it. We can see it coming and stuff like that. But generally, groundwater, especially for everybody, is harder for people to get their mind wrapped around. One of the things that I have noticed, especially with groundwater, is that you can't see it. And so a lot of times people don't realize what's below their ground because they can't see it. It's even like people who want to study water in a lot of ways. They all want to study lakes and streams and rivers. And I'm like, well, that's great. It's a very small part of our drinking water and a small part of our water on the planet, fresh water. Most of our water is groundwater, and it's below the surface, but we just don't see it. So it's out of sight, out of mind. So it's very difficult for people to wrap their minds around groundwater pollution too, and how long it takes for groundwater to actually move. So we will talk a lot about this when we get to a civil action. Just because somebody dumps something today doesn't mean you're going to get it in your drinking water well tomorrow. There's a very long transport time. And so part of the problem is and I'll use an example with fracking. The people all of a sudden, they started fracking and now I've got gas and, they turn on their water and then they can catch it on fire like the next day or within a short period of time. But the person never tested their water before the fracking ever occurred. So we don't know if that gas was already in their water, because for the pollutants to happen from the fracking to get to their well is actually a really long time. It takes a long time for contaminants to move through the environment. I had a project I was dealing down south of here in a little town, and the contaminant that the shallow drinking water wells for the mobile homes and some of the homes had, they were having BTEX, the benzene, toluene, ethylbenzenes, and xylenes inside of their water. And they wanted to blame the new sand. There was a sand mining going on, and that just started, and they were saying, well, because the sand mining is happening, now my groundwater is contaminated. But cause and effect, what it was is when you looked at what their pollutant was and how long, and looked at all the environmental factors, it was actually mom and pop's gas station that closed down 20 years that was now the contaminant finally had migrated to their homes. And they're like, no, they've been out of business for 20 years. And I'm like, yes, it took that long for it to move the mile from that place to your home. And so a lot of times people cannot comprehend how slow groundwater moves. Okay. Some of the other reasons why groundwater contamination is such more of a difficult field to work in is detection. Groundwater contamination is often difficult or expensive to detect. Okay. Well, for a lake and stream, you can see the whole lake, right? And so you can sample every spot along the whole surface because you can see everything. Well, with groundwater, I may have a well here for a, this big size area. So I'm making out of one point, I'm making expansive ideas about what's going on there. Okay. So the contamination can be where you're sitting at, Cheyenne, but I'm taking the sample here and I say, it's not contaminated. Well, it is contaminated. It's just we can't see it. Also, it's very dilute. The groundwater dilutes the pollutants very much. So what ends up happening too is we get very low concentrations. So we have to collect a large quantity of water to get to them. So most cases affect only if the water supply is being affected. So usually we don't find out there's a pollutant until somebody puts in a drinking water sample and somebody gets sick. before we actually even know, or somebody tests their well. And we'll talk about groundwater wells and stuff like that. Like their cities have to have their water tested, but if you're in a rural community, you never have to test your water. So your neighbor could know you're polluted, but you'll never know unless you test. And so a lot of times it's very expensive to test your water. Another reason that groundwater is so hard is it's spectacularly unsuccessful cleanups in the past. Again, because of the way because it's the contaminant, and we're going to spend a lot of time this semester talking about it. We're going to talk about blobs and globs, and we're going to talk about how contaminants get stuck inside of there, and we're going to talk about some of the math associated with it and the equations that we use in order to model some of these things. But what ends up happening is the contaminant gets stuck into the low hydraulic conductivity zones. So the contaminant will get into the clay, and then that little clay lens will act as a constant source of pollutants and just constantly oozing out that pollutant into the environment. So that's a big problem. There's a poor understanding of the physical, chemical, and biological processes of groundwater. I mean, we know the basics of things, and that's what we're going to be going over. But as a physical site, if you guys are going to go into site investigations, there can be problems associated with that. And so sometimes we don't fully understand everything. It's often difficult to find and remove the source of contamination. So just trying to find where did it come from is sometimes not known, or there could be multiple sources of it. So gasoline stations, every gasoline manufacturer has a different way of fingerprinting. The way they make their gasoline changes between manufacturers. And so sometimes you can fingerprint the gasoline to say, oh, it's coming from that gas station versus this gas station. And then there's also the idea of unrealistic expectations. People expect that you put in a remediation, it'll be cleaned up in a very short period of time. Pump and treat, which is the number two way, because the first thing you do is you remove the source of the pollution and dig up all the soil. Number two thing you do is what's called pump and treat. You pump the groundwater out, you treat it, and then you re-inject the clean groundwater back into the ground. A gas station, a pump and treat system can take 10 years. And people are like, what do you mean? I set this up as this is going to clean the system. And there's like, no, we're going to have to do this. And you're going to have to keep paying for the uptake and the maintenance of this equipment for 10 years to clean up your site. And so the expectation is it's like, oh, I'll just put in a Brita filter and it cleans up the site. Or can't you just go out to a site and pick it all up? And it's like, no, it's so far down, it's trapped. We can't remove it all. It's not like we can excavate every soil. And then even when we excavate, what do we do with all that contaminated soil? Well, we have to burn it. We have to landfill it. We still have to deal with it. So this very much, people don't realize how much it costs. And we're going to get to that in the end of the class. We'll start talking about remediation techniques. And we'll talk about cost associated with them and what you have to do to remediate sites. So there's a lot of unrealistic expectations. Another really big problem is predicting the pathways. So you really have to know your geology of the site, and you really have to know how the groundwater is flowing. And you could have two sites right next to each other, like in this example here, and this site could be leaking and contaminating this whole large area. Well, number two does absolutely nothing. Number two here, when underneath number one, is now polluting over here. And so you have to know how the groundwater is moving in order to know where and understand the geology of the site. Slow movement of groundwater, like I said, groundwater moves in meters per year. I mean, you're not talking like it moves like lickety spit. It moves really slow, and we'll get into some of those calculations. And so it takes 10 years to flush a site. It takes a very long time to move groundwater. And then the influence of small-scale heterogeneities that are in there. So here in the Midwest, we have glacial sediments. And with those glacial sediments, we will have, it may look really flat out there, but when you drill, oh my gosh, it's like all of a sudden you'll hit clay, then a sand lens like this, then clay, then you could move your drill rig over 3 feet, drill down, and not even hit that sand lens because it pinches out so quickly. You can't follow where things are because the glaciers laid down this very complex sediments around here. So it becomes really difficult. And those little heterogeneities of changing how the fining up occurs, the soil and stuff like that, changes how the pollutant will move through the environment. So it becomes really difficult. So you actually have to really understand the geology and small heterological changes that'll change everything about the system. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to hit my stop button.